Hey, so thank you very much to the panel and welcome everybody. I am Stefano Fabeni. I'm the Executive Director of Synergia Initiatives for Human Rights, and I'm the Synergia together with Le Mouvement pour la Liberté Individuelle, Molly, here represented by Staro Gori, and the US government. Kerry Ashford will join very soon. We are co-chair of the Donors Coordination thematic group of the Equal Rights Coalition. So on behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you and I thank you for joining this webinar. I'm pleased to tell you that this webinar has got the attention of a number of countries, so we are very pleased to have had and I see some of the representatives are here from the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Italy, France, Belgium, Argentina, Uruguay, and Germany. So thank you very much to all and some cooperation agencies, USAID, SIDA. So thank you very much to the countries who joined. And as I always do as a disclaimer, if any country member of the Equal Rights Coalition would like to join the Donors Coordination Working Group, please do not hesitate to be in touch with the co-chair. Very briefly, this is one of the events as part of the working plan of the working group. We are planning to have a number of events to share information, good practice, and really provide some building knowledge about topics that are relevant for the work of our working group. And we thought it was particularly important and particularly urgent to have a conversation about funding and investments in the African region. Obviously, the late events with the passing of the draconian legislation in Uganda and alarming movements that we are seeing in some other countries certainly sort of like sparkle our attention and put this webinar particularly on at the top of our priorities. But in fact, we even before this last unfortunate event, we had already planned to have this conversation because particularly with Star and I had been reflecting on the fact that too often, and particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa, I think this is a problem that we have in our funding streams. Very often, we tend to be alarmed and we tend to invest only when we see that something is happening. So we've been seeing, again, considering Africa, situations of countries that were considered fairly safe, and so where investments were not considered important, and then suddenly becoming an emergency because our oppositions decided to invest, having probably a better long-term vision that we sometimes have as movement, and by movement I mean ecosystem, including donors. Other situations of achievements. We get an achievement and we sort of like say, oh, okay, so this is checked, done, and we move somewhere else. We don't think that sometimes an achievement needs resources to be sustained. And so we have a number of examples of that, or situations where something positive is happening, and actually we realize that there was an opportunity that luckily materialized itself, but where we didn't have necessarily significant part in it. So and here really like different categories, and but really like Uganda, Ghana, Botswana, Angola, the regional system, the African Commission. These are all examples where or Gabon, where we could have done differently. So I am joined by a great panelist of colleagues that are like that are very dear to me, to us, and certainly with a wealth of expertise in the region that will guide us in this panel. Before giving the virtual pass the virtual microphone to Aruj, I would like to ask Star to say a few words.
Thank you, Stefano, and good morning, bonjour, bon après-midi à tout le monde. Je suis très content que nous avons cette opportunité de pouvoir avoir ce webinaire que nous avons préparé depuis très longtemps et où nous voulons beaucoup plus focaliser sur ce que nous voulons maintenant, mais aussi pour changer notre futur, mais aussi pour garder un œil, un cap sur l'investissement sur le long terme. Ça fait, je pense, 30 minutes avant le début de cette réunion que j'ai reçu une vidéo qui est en circulation d'une déclaration des églises évangéliques au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire qui veulent beaucoup plus se positionner et être vocales contre l'agenda du mouvement LGBTQI. Et ça, c'est un autre signe au fait que les pays dans lesquels nous pensions que it's safe, qu'il était vraiment sécurisé, c'en n'est pas pour autant. Il y a un grand investissement qui est en cours, il y a de grandes attaques qui sont faites contre les droits des femmes, contre les droits sexuels et reproductifs. Et toutes ces discussions est menée, et tout ce travail est mené par tout un ensemble d'acteurs et actrices religieux, extrémistes et conservateurs, politiciens conservateurs qui profitent et surfent sur des vents contre l'Occident, mais aussi qui profitent de tout discours qui focalise sur l'inclusion pour essayer de continuer à harceler et à exclure nos communautés. Donc, sans trop tarder, j'aimerais vraiment remercier les panélistes qui ont pu libérer leur temps pour partager leur expertise, pour aussi nous partager les visions des communautés qu'ils, elles, desservent. Et je suis très content d'avoir surtout dans le panel des organisations qui écoutent les communautés, mais aussi qui sont capables de venir maintenant pour enrichir et augmenter les connaissances que ce soit des partenaires des gouvernements, mais aussi que ce soit des activistes et autres acteurs dans le milieu philanthropique qui veulent mieux faire. Sans trop tarder, Aruj, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. And Stefano and Star, thank you so much for your comments to help frame out this discussion. And yeah, to reiterate that there are a lot of conversations happening right now around, especially the crisis in Uganda. And you know, as my role, I manage the Dignity for All Consortium, and two of our consortium members are here on the panel, Uhai and Senegia. And as a rapid response donor, we certainly, you know, see sort of in real time, the emergencies that are happening globally. And I would just say for Uganda, the numbers that we're receiving are just astounding. Starting from this year, we've already received around 230 requests. And when we compare that to the last year, it was 92. So, you know, the incredible amount of number that we're seeing here certainly relates to the introduction of the bill, which is now signed. But I also want to point out that we've been seeing an increase in the requests we've been getting from Uganda in the last several years. Before, and especially before the pandemic, our numbers were around 28, you know, a year. And we've seen an increase from that to 50 to then 90, and now we're seeing around 230. So this is not happening in a vacuum. You know, even before the introduction of the bill, we were seeing the impact of COVID and how devastating that impact has been on our communities. Economically, and the rise in authoritarianism and the globally coordinated movements around anti-gender ideology and anti-rights movements. So this panel is really aiming to take a step back and to look at, while we have our eye on these emergencies, how do we broaden and reset this conversation? What do we think about in terms of the long-term support needed to LGBTQI movements in sub-Saharan Africa? And as Stefano was saying, either sometimes we see a lot of money going in around a crisis that is not helpful if it's not invested strategically and actually can lead to a longer term harm, or we see too little investment and it kind of takes away from the sustainability of movements and their ability to resist when there is an emergency or a crisis. So how do we build those sustainable movements is an important question for us, for not this moment, but for the next several years out. And so we're really lucky to have this conversation with civil society in the region, whose lived realities and long-term investment and relationship to the indigenous LGBTQI rights movements in sub-Saharan Africa can help give us an analysis of what we need to do beyond this moment. And so I would love for our panelists to introduce themselves and give us a little bit of background about their work. So I will start with Caroline, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here on this call. My name is Caroline Ouassit Amon, and I'm the Executive Director of ISDAO, Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest, ISDAO. ISDAO is a West African LGBTQI activist-led fund working across West Africa, in particular in 9 countries of the region. And so we are a participatory grant maker. That's one of the ways in which we see our role in supporting the movement is through flexible resources that are responding to core needs and also specific needs that organizations identify. In addition to knowledge production around the state of the movement, and I'll be talking a little bit later about one of those pieces of research. So I'll end here and more from me later.
Great, thank you. Robert, could you go next, please?
Hello, everyone. This is Robert from PAI, Pan-Africa ILGA. We are a Pan-African organization. Our aim is to ensure a regional approach to addressing the LGBT situation in Africa. The main goal is to ensure that, 1, activists have the capacity to address the challenges they face in their countries. 2, that they are safe. 3, that we have good representation in the various spaces like here, like at the UN, at the African Commission. The LGBT situation becomes a topic that is important.
Oh, Robert?
Yes, I believe we lost Robert.
Oh. Robert, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No. Can you try again? Uh-oh. Okay. While we wait for Robert, Neville, can you go next, please?
Thank you, Uruj. Hi, everyone. I'm Neville Gabriel from the Other Foundation based in Johannesburg. We are Southern African LGBTI Community Foundation, working across 13 countries in the Southern African region. We primarily work as a movement builder, mostly through research and convenings, and as a grant maker, also doing participatory grant making. And most of the grant support that we give to LGBTI activist groups and allies across the region is for organizing and advocacy, sometimes in targeted spheres, like in working with religious communities, or on economic participation, or parents and families of LGBTI people, but also general grant making. Yeah, and we are a sibling to UHAI and ISTA.
Great, thank you. And Mukami?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Mukami Marete, the Executive Director of UHAI, the East Africa Sexual Health and Rights Initiative, UHAI ISHRI. We are activist fund resourcing LGBT and sex worker movements in the Eastern African region, in 7 countries in the Eastern African region. We are a participatory fund, so most of our grant making, our strategic development and convening really is activist led. We resource movements. We also supporting capacity. We also play a role in movement building, and in particular getting people together, and also knowledge generation. Yes.
Thanks, Mukami. And Robert, I see that you're back online. Do you want to say anything else?
Yes, hello. Sorry. So I was saying, yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Robert, and I'm with Pan-Africa ILGA. And Pan-Africa ILGA is a Pan-African regional organization, and our focus is basically on ensuring protection of human rights of all LGBT persons in Africa. Our main focus is also on ensuring representation of LGBT people across every platform, especially on international human rights platforms like the UN and the African Commission and any other platform that gives us an opportunity to really get the human rights protection of LGBT people in Africa. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Robert. So the first question is, I'll ask Mukami, Caroline, and Neville to comment on, which is in terms of the context that you're seeing. Can you tell us a little bit about what is going on and how do we end up here? And Mukami, I'll start with you. And I know that when we were talking about this panel, you were saying, what would it look like if there was an investment, a continued investment in Uganda for the last 10 years, and that wasn't in this moment there was all of this influx of support, but what has really been going on in the last decade since the previous rendition of the anti-homosexuality bill. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about what's going on and your reflections.
Yes, thank you, Ruj. Absolutely. We've heard a lot about the current moment in Uganda, where we have the Anti-Homosexuality Act 2023. A lot of us were there when we had the Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2013, so this is yet another iteration of what is going on in Uganda. I also want to talk to say that Kenya is also going through its own moment with threatening to have an anti-LGBTIQ act, or rather bill, introduced into parliament that very similar to Uganda, with the additional around access to hormonal therapy, and very specific language that further criminalizes people who are trans people. And even just going back to Uganda, we have the AHA, but we also have another
bill that is being introduced that is very specific to access to hormonal therapy that then will be make it very difficult, further difficult for our trans siblings. At Tanzania, we in 2016, 2015, gathered around tables like this, also talking about the crisis in Tanzania with Magufuli laws and, the crackdown that was
Mukami, I think you froze.
Yes, we lost Mukami.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna stay off video.
Okay.
Just to look at the bandwidth. Yes. So I was saying that in Tanzania in the last 3 months, we've had 3 people being jailed, 6 people being jailed for 30 years. We've had there's similar to Uganda, there's a lot of internal displacement of people within the country, and also folks starting to leave the country because it's not safe. And so as we are talking about this is also coming, and I think Stefano mentioned that this is coming within a background of folk who also had to go through COVID and whose government was scapegoating them around this and who are not able to access services that were being offered, so it's their movements that are already impoverished economically. There are movements that are already struggling to keep the lights on as organizations, because the kind of funding that they have kept receiving over the period has been, project short-term, many times inflexible. And so there are movements that already the movement infrastructure has been shaky. And then now there is, this that is happening now. So in terms of the context in the region, there's a lot of, questioning around, okay, so what would it look like if our movements were resourced in a way that then would be able to help them withstand such attacks? What does movement infrastructure look like? And we are talking in the different regions, in the different ways. What does support for legal strategies beyond taking our governments to court around acts like this look like continuously? What does that kind of actually look? What investment that are long term? I think lastly, I would also like to say that we also know that our movements don't exist in a vacuum. They also exist within a broader civil society organizing in the countries that they work in. So the geopolitics also affect our movements. You find that in Kenya, the moment we had a new president, a different president who's being called out on corruption, on economic, high inflation. So it is very convenient for the LGBT, for the diversion of, conversations to have LGBTIQ people be the people to be the diversionary tactic. The same can be said for Museveni. He's a dictator who's been there for many years and who the country as a whole has a lot of questions towards him. So what is the place of, even as we see what's behind these laws and these attacks on communities? It's beyond the communities. It's beyond, there's a lot of scapegoating. But when that is happening, people are dying. People cannot access services. People have to leave their homes, and a whole other lot of issues that we all know. So I'm just going to pause there, Uruj.
Yes, thank you so much for that context, Mukami. So going to you, Caroline, can you provide us some context with what's going on where you are?
Sure. As I mentioned,
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I also can't see
Oh.
anything.
Oh, I thought it was my
Oh.
internet. I think we lost Caroline.
Oh, Caroline.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was better.
Yeah, I don't even see Caroline. Okay. Neville, can we go to you and then we'll come back to Caroline? Just having some technical difficulties today.
Yeah, thanks, Suruj. So maybe by way of responding, I'll refer back to the broad question that you put, Uruj, which this panel is unpacking, and that's how to coherently resolve what can be a dilemma of responding to emergencies in an appropriate way, while also supporting long-term progress. And I think that one of the ways to do that is to analyze what the drivers are of what we're seeing now. I've been thinking of this in terms of what might be the push factors and also what might be the pull factors. When I look at the context, it seems to me that there are two important push factors that we are seeing. And one is, very importantly, that this is a backlash. It's a backlash to increased organizing, increased voice, increased visibility of LGBTI people, or at least the perception that that is growing across the region. So I think it's important to recognize that LGBTI people and their organizations in Africa are not the victims of circumstance simply, but that a lot of work has been happening and a lot of pushback, a lot of advocacy, a lot of organizing. And so we should see the current trend as I think a stronger organized backlash against that. The second push factor, so most of the instances that we are seeing are actually not driven by governments voluntarily. They appear to be mostly opposition politicians who are strongly aligned with religious right-wing groups. It appears that many of them are backed financially and politically by right-wing groups internationally. And it's clear that the religious right has become politically emboldened in a new way. And that they are using tactics in parliaments, but also more broadly in the mass media, in social media, in a way to embarrass governments into taking a position or taking a stance or reacting. One of the most important pull factors that I've seen, and I want to put it in this way, when the Speaker of the Ugandan Parliament introduced the bill for adoption, they said, the Ugandan people have spoken, and then went on to invite the members of parliament to enact the will of the Ugandan people, so to speak. So one of the pull factors is this belief that African people are, the assumption that African people are necessarily homophobic, and that populations in their majority will support homophobic laws. The courts, in all the cases that we've tracked in Southern Africa, litigation for decriminalization or registration of organizations, a strong argument that seems to be put forward in all the courts when governments or others oppose progress is the argument that the people of the country are not ready for this change. So this strong narrative that is being put forth, that public opinion is against equality and freedom for LGBTI people in Africa. The truth is that we actually don't know what African populations in the entirety think. The scientific work, research work to do to assess that hasn't properly been done in any representative way. And it seems to me that doing that work of gathering data and analyzing it in nationally representative ways is critically important to strengthen the success of litigation of various sorts in the courts, but also to pull the rug out from under the feet of reactionary politicians, the religious right, who are initiating hate campaigns in many countries in the region. And I unfortunately believe that we as LGBTI activist movements are currently on the back foot on this. We're seeing the emergence just recently now in Namibia, where the Prime Minister last week, I think it was, made a statement in Parliament that they will be introducing a new bill to revise the law on which the court, the High Court of the Supreme Court of Namibia ruled in favor of a homosexual couple marriage being recognized. They were married outside of Namibia and moved to Namibia. But similarly in Malawi, in Zambia, and even in South Africa recently, with organized hate campaigns being driven by politicians who are in opposition to the government and who are strongly aligned with religious right-wing organizations. So that's how I would characterize the situation. I would want to highlight that in all the cases that I've looked at, this is all driven by male politicians, by men. And this is an interesting dynamic that I think needs to be highlighted, because it speaks directly to the anti-gender progress movement. Thank you, Urush.
Thanks, everyone. Just FYI, there's a comment for you in the chat. So Caroline, are you back?
Yeah, I am, but I'm also happy to elaborate more on the next question. If I'm just thinking about time and also wanting to ensure that we have enough time for any questions or to engage.
Yeah, definitely. And then, yeah, and you can add to that as we move forward. So thank you for laying out that context. And this next question is also for Neville and Mokami and Caroline. And, the idea of this panel coming together was to really stitch together a bigger context for what we're seeing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you all can comment on, as you're hearing from each other and as we were preparing and of course monitoring the situation more broadly, how are you seeing the developments in your specific context relate to the larger regional context and also globally, because of course, this is all linked, especially, around what we're seeing with anti-gender ideology movements, for example, that are both coordinated globally, but then become very localized, for example. So yeah, and I know there's some research that you all had also wanted to highlight. So we'd love to hear more about that. And maybe Caroline, you can start us off with that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think it is important to provide this overall context. And one of the things several years ago, ISDAO and QAIN, Queer African Youth Network, decided to engage a bit more around the questions of anti-gender movements and gender ideology in West Africa. Because one of the things that for us, we were seeing the connections, but there was very little documentation that existed specific to West Africa and what was happening with anti-gender movements. And so we engaged in a process and research, and there's a publication called Who's Afraid of Gender that we produced, that we published last year that summarizes the results. We also looked at case studies in 3 countries, in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, and in Ghana. And what was really important for us to understand is to unpack, okay, so there's this global movement, but what does it look like at a country and regional level? How are LGBTQI communities and organizations engaging? But also, how do some of these actors who are saying or making statements and engaging in conversations that's very connected to the anti-gender movement, how do they understand these questions? And one of the things that we found, one is whereas in this space, especially in a funder and bilateral conversations, we're talking a lot about using these terms. There's still a lot of lack of clarity around what these terms are, what they actually mean. And so then it becomes difficult to kind of strategize around it when there's actual murkiness around the terms. But we found that there is a variety of actors, right? And I think what Aruj just mentioned of forces, large global organizations, the kind that we know have very significant funding connected to global movements. And then there's also what's happening at the homegrown level. And so we found that there is quite a variety of actors. And in terms of funding, it was difficult to trace some of the sources of funding, but we did find connections to international organizations and networks that claim to defend family values in the US and Turkey, Iran, and so different kinds of connections, but also, as I mentioned, very homegrown. But I think one of the things that was the most interesting, I guess it's interesting and also frustrating, is that the kinds of some of the actors that we would hope would be our allies are actually, there's the fine line that's being drawn around LGBTQI, and also rethinking, even challenging these questions of gender. So in countries like Senegal, which, for many decades, there's been a very strong Senegalese feminist movement. There's been advancements around all kinds of questions related to gender equity. We found, actors who've been involved in this saying, we actually, the term gender is a foreign term. Why are we talking about gender-based violence when violence is violence? Why do we need to use gender in this context? It's actually a Western import. So we're seeing a lot of kind of rollback of many of the wins or many of the gains that have been made, and challenges to things that we kind of took for granted. And so you had individuals from broader civil society and from feminist organizations in countries like Burkina Faso and Senegal who would say, I'm all for the rights, I'm all for advancing human rights and supporting human rights. I'm for support of access to safe abortion, but LGBTQI, I draw the line. This is a Western import. This is an agenda that the West is trying to impose in our country context. We also found that there's a lot of different ways in which anti-gender actors are engaging in our various contexts in West Africa. People, of course, there's the political connection, but also I think an important piece is the media. And Neville talked about this. This point, where is the discourse coming from? Who are, how is that, where is the narrative coming from and who's shaping the discourse? And when you look at the questions of media, the fact that in Ghana in 2021, there was the National Day of Prayer with many of the major media houses and political leaders, prayer against LGBTQI and prayer against homosexuality that filled a state, that filled a conference center. So the role that media is playing in perpetuating certain narratives and really closing the door to alternative narratives, and that has a big impact around this conversation. So there's a lot of strategies that we're seeing. We're also seeing, of course, legislation. I mean, I think we've all been talking about introduction of new bills and introduction of more criminalizing bills or attempts to introduce criminalizing bills. But I think it's important to recognize there are many ways in which actors are engaging, and the bills are just one part of it. The bills and the policy change is just one part of it, but large scale marches like we've seen in Senegal, the role of media, there are a number of ways in which we're seeing the movement show up. And again, it's not always specified, it's not always kind of couched specifically as gender ideology or anti-gender, but very much in line with this discourse of global anti-gender movements. To not take up too much time, I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to elaborate on any other points. And I'll share the link. The report is actually not publicly available for security reasons related to the sensitivity of this work, but we can make it available to anyone who is interested and would request it. So I'll share the link.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Neville, any additional comments you would like to add to this question?
Yeah, Ulrich, let me just respond to the question from Julie Dorf as well, asking for a bit more on the Namibia situation. So it was actually on the 6th of June, the Prime Minister gave a statement in Parliament, and in essence said that the government will be introducing a new bill to amend the clause in the Immigration Control Act, on which the court ruled in favor of a homosexual couple's marriage being recognized. It's in relation to people in Namibia who were married outside the country, but the court had also, in its judgment, reversed a previous ruling in a case brought by a homosexual couple in Namibia. So essentially, this is to block any further legal precedent in the courts and to block any full litigation for marriage equality in Namibia. On the broader issue, Rajai, I think the narrative work that Caroline had been speaking about is critically important. So activists in the region, I think, need to recognize that we are in a new phase of activism, and we need to relook at some of the strategies that we've previously adopted and look at how we might do different things or do things differently from before. The analysis of what's driving public opinion and what public opinion actually is critically important to be able to shift the narrative. And in my view, we should be doing more work that presents a narrative that is not to convince populations that there's nothing wrong with homosexuality or gender nonconformity, that homosexuality is right, so to speak, and shift the narrative to homophobia is wrong. Because that speaks directly to the backlash that we are facing right now. So if there's anything that I would want to highlight about what we might try to do differently going forward, it's that narrative change work and speaking to the broad public and not in our closed circles of activism.
Right. Thank you for your reflections there, Neville. Turning to you, Mukami, sort of hearing from Caroline and Neville, kind of what are you sort of seeing? I mean, I know that you're in the midst of it all, but just sort of any broader reflections that are helpful for you in this moment and would be helpful to share would be great to hear.
Absolutely. Yes, I think it's important as we are looking at the context from what Caroline and Neville have shared to realize that the coordination of the anti-rights movement is, it's very well coordinated, and there is quite a lot of speaking the same language and, attacking from different places, including folk who have been allies and in places where the LGBTIQ movements have had some traction in the past. For example, we learned about the drafting of an Africa Family Bill that is being seen to counter the Maputo Protocol, and this is being led by Kenya and Uganda, I think Malawi, Ghana, and a fifth country that I forget. And so it's important, to just see that there are connections, and not just to what is happening like in the continent, globally. Actually, that the machine is quite coordinated, and it's not and it's a move that is not a recent, it's been organizing for years. And so I really resonate with Neville when he says that how then our activism looks like really has to, it has to be different. How resourcing also looks like has to be different because of just the forces that then are at play, both here in the continent, at home, and also with very strong connections to the West. So as with very great visibility at how homophobia has really successfully been imported into the region and still keeps being well supported.
Thanks, Mukami. And that's actually a really great segue into sort of the third and last question from our side is our recommendations. There are donors, donor governments in the space, and everything that you all have laid out. What are some of the ways to do long-term resourcing so we don't continue to find ourselves in these moments of crises? And one of the points that we were talking about is also how the coordinated resourcing of the opposition, and including sometimes funding by governments. And so there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of recommendations. So would love to hear that. And we'll start with Robert, if you can share with us from your perspective some recommendations for folks who are here today.
Thank you very much. First of all, to say thank you for the opportunity. and also to say that this is a great opportunity to really look at the funding and the resources structure. I think one of the panelists already mentioned it around if we looked at how to fund the movement more strategically, more long-term, than having a lot of short-term activities given to the activists and movement on the ground. That would be very great. I think one of the greatest challenges that has come is how do we sustain activists who work in this space? I think that one of the problem has always been that people work in the space and they are not properly funded to take care of themselves and their well-being. I think that would be a great point for me to say that we need to look at how do we resource people who work in this space to stay long-term, to feel that this is a job that you're doing. A lot of these organizations work with volunteers, and a lot of them work on ad hoc basis. And this does not look like a strong foundation that can stand against a well-funded system in any country. If you go to Tanzania, I mean, we're working with the Tanzanian movement to build a document that we can send to donors and partners for the issues that are happening. And you see that everybody says, look, we don't have the staff, we don't have the people, can you help us develop this document? Because the foundation is weak. We will always come back and do firefighting if we don't do a clear, strong system of supporting the activists on the ground and ensuring that this support is long-term, address long-term issues, and do not look at only firefighting. When we hear Uganda burning, we run. When we hear Ghana burning, we run, but rather seeing how do we invest in a way that it will be a system that is built strong so that when anything comes, it's able to handle it on its own. Activists in Africa handling their own issues in a way that they are resourced and understand the issues themselves to take it forward, than to have short-term resourcing and having small projects that do not fund basic things like salaries and social welfare and well-being. These things are things that are not supported by so many funding agencies, and that limits the activists from being strong in the system because then they are looking for something else. I was just talking to an activist in Ghana who has been in the system for about, let's say, 20 years, and you ask him, where is your social security? He doesn't have one. So if a parliamentarian is speaking to such a person, where is the power? Where is the strength to stand against such a parliamentarian in parliament? So for me, these are the things that I think will be a key thing, that if we're looking at doing a long-term resourcing and strong systems that will help hold these issues will be a key thing for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Caroline, can I bring you in for these recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Robert, for that point. As you were speaking, I was remembering there's a quote in the report that came from one of the interviews with activists that sticks with me. And it was originally in French. C'est parce que tu as envie que tu peux lutter. It's because you're alive that you can fight. And I think that for me is one of the biggest things. How do we ensure that, how are we investing and supporting the people that are leading this work? And I think it's everything that Robert said. When we also, other recommendations that came from activists in our report is around investing in the mental health. And I would say I would go even beyond that mental health of communities, but also how do we invest in holistic care, collective and individual care and well-being, because we all read the headlines and we know these are particularly challenging times, and for both people who are at the forefront, who as well as community members that are not at the forefront, but are the ones that are amongst the people who are being attacked or being threatened, and who would have very little recourse in terms of, being able to go to have other options. So I think investing in the mental health, we also heard from activists that it would, particularly how can funders support solidarity and movement building work, including work and connections with other movements and broader civil society, because recognizing that the challenges that we face are not only our challenges, but there are ways in which there's a need to build stronger connections and stronger movement to resist, especially as we look at forces that are very well funded and funded for a long time and have a lot of power. We also need to build power at a national and regional level. And including with building power is investing in legal education, continuing, I know I've heard Mukami talk about this a lot. Yes, respond to emergencies, but continue to fund organizing and organizations. We can't just put all of our money into response. There's continuously core work that organizations need to be able to do, and having funding that enables them to respond to that. So those are some of the things that I think are also important. But I think the other thing is some internal reflection, especially amongst bilateral donors, and coordination. There's been, there were two reports that were published earlier this year, one by the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, looking at government funding for the anti-gender movement, and that's gone, towards actors that are actually against our communities, from some of the donors who are also supporting our communities. There was some research that was produced by IPAS recently looking specifically at Ghana and tracking the relationships between different actors in Ghana to actors and organizations and funding from the US in particular, but not exclusively the US. So I think there's also, how do we ensure that we are actually living the principles of do no harm? And how can there also be better coordination in government and bilateral within bilateral donors around funding, to ensure that while we're funding work that is advancing the rights of LGBTQI persons, we're not also funding work that is countering that.
Yeah, that's really important and a powerful message for folks here. Thank you for that. Caroline, Neville, would love to go next to you for your recommendations.
Yeah, I'd highlight 4 recommendations. The one is that we really do need to intensify work with religious groups, support activist groups to directly engage with religious organizations, and to do that, enable that to be done more consistently. We need to recognize that there's a mighty battle going on in particularly the Christian churches across the region, that this is a contested space now, that we should not pull back from engaging or allow the hate campaigns that are being initiated in several churches to become the dominant narrative in religious organizations. And there's a clamor to rein in inter-church structures, so councils of churches in many countries in the region, who have tended to move faster than individual church denominations. In Southern Africa, the Christian churches are the strongest religious organizations. So in the anti-apartheid struggle, we often refer to the churches as a site of struggle. I would recommend that we support that kind of strategic posture in relation to religious groups. The second is that we really do need to fund the expensive work. The nationally representative public opinion polls are hugely expensive to do in many parts of the region, but it is necessary work that needs to be done now more than ever if we are to see the enable the success of litigation or counter the religiously inspired political backlash. The third is that we really do need to continue to intensify investment in movement building in two ways. One is building strong and resilient organizations, LGBTI people's organizations, who can stand up to the backlash that we're experiencing now, but also by strengthening relationships between different organizations in country and regionally. The fourth is that I believe there is a way of making long-term commitments, funding commitments that provide a level of reliability, predictability, but at the same time allowing within that a level of flexibility, agility, so that LGBTI people and their organizations can respond to situations as they come up and learn and adapt their strategies to the changing context, and it is changing rapidly right now. And I do believe that part of the resolution to that, what can sound like a conflict or a contradiction there, is to support participatory grant-making mechanisms through long-term commitments, but which then allow for that kind of agility and flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neville. Mukami, would you like to comment anything that you haven't heard already by other panelists and things? Yeah.
Yeah, well, my colleagues have really said it all, and what it is that I would like to add two things. One being funding that is not like it's outside, that is not siloed. You know, if you're funding human rights work, you're funding human rights work. LGBTQ violence is human rights work. So, like, because I think a lot of times, you know, organizations have to really fit very squarely in this, you know, silos that are built within funding, including ring fencing. And I know a lot of, I mean, we are talking to government funders here, and their country priorities, which you know, which are usually set, and the ring fencing then just means that there are countries that may not get the attention, may not be in the news, may not be in the attention that then get left behind in terms of how they are resourced. And yes, so just to have an eye on that. Secondly, the last point that I would also like to make is just around the sustainability. Is let's not only talk when there's a crisis. I think the going into what's happening, how is it the coordination, the continuous support of movements beyond an intra-crisis, so that even as crisis happens, we are one, not starting to figure out how do we start working together, but also we know that we are drawing on, you know, an infrastructure that has been continuously supported, continuously resourced, and there's that kind of coordination. So those are the two things that I just wanted to highlight.
Thank you for that, Mukami. And you know, we would love to, we have some time for Q&A where folks can ask questions, but I wanted to just say my deep appreciation for all of you for finding the time. This moment, you know, I cannot imagine everything that you all are holding personally and professionally in this moment, and being able to kind of lay out the landscape for us and be able to have a call to action for what's needed, so that we don't continue to find ourselves in this moment over and over again where the crises are relentless. You know, just being able to have that broader perspective, it's been so powerful to hear from you. So thank you so much for your time. And now I would like to open up the Q&A, and I think folks are able to talk in real time, and we can maybe take a few questions at a time, but there were some in the chat that wanted to also make sure that were responded to. The first one is around concerns around data privacy and misuse of government or NGO data to target LGBTQI populations. And the other is around, and maybe this one, Mukami, maybe you can speak to that, but in terms of what's going on in Kenya, the question is, beyond sort of the emergency support, what are the long-term advocacy strategies to stop such laws from being enacted in the first place? So any comments on that? Maybe Mukami, we can start with you, and then we'll go back to the other question.
Yes, the question by Georgina is very valid in terms of and I think I'll still go back to the place and Georgina has highlighted to it around long-term advocacy, resourcing long-term advocacy strategies. A lot of, in the region, not just in Kenya, a lot of organizations are funded year to year. And so just when, a strategy is starting to get momentum and you've gotten the year of so-and-so, then you have no funding. You have to start all over again. And it loses momentum in that way. And so everything that a lot of the panelists have said today around why it's necessary to fund in the long haul, in terms of to invest in movements in the long haul, because then it ensures that traction and that folk are not always just wondering whether even as we start this, is it going to continue happening next year or the other. And this is a call to action that the philanthropy sector have had repeatedly from activists, funders long-term, funders flexibly. Stay with us in the fight.
Thanks, Mukami. Robert?
Yes, and I quickly wanted to add something that we've realized recently in trying to address even these issues that are happening, the funding of humanitarian causes and humanitarian issues. So now we are having these emergencies and we are having these situations. But most of our funding are advocacy-based funding, human rights, legal, and all of that. Now, people are being thrown out of their homes. People are being thrown out of their jobs. We need some emergency funding that can support people for the short while. How do we start thinking about funding that it also goes to humanitarian causes in times like this when we have these situations? Because a number of the organizations that are funded now have to go and rethink through how do they get their donors to repurpose their funding so that they can take care of these things. So as we think about long-term funding and maybe thinking about how do we restructure funding to support instances, because we know that there could be instances where there are going to be times when LGBT people are going to be beaten, thrown out of their homes. How do we structure funding towards ensuring that we take care of these situations so that they don't spiral out of our hands? Thank you. Just a quick one too.
No, that's really a great point, Robert, because with Dignity for All, for example, we are an emergency donor, but we fund on it's very specific, our mandate, and a lot of times we're not able to fund humanitarian support. But even then, the amount of money that is going towards humanitarian support because other avenues are not there and our communities really need that support to survive, that's a big question. And the other piece is also that we see is, when we talk about Dignity, it was established 10 plus years ago, and the moment we're in is so different. And the other, the big piece of refugees and asylees, human rights defenders who are not able to go back home permanently, what happens? That's a whole other conversation that I think also, and I think as we're seeing these crises unfold, we will see movement. We are seeing movements of people, and that those resources absolutely need to be invested for those communities to be able to be okay. There was another, I see Caroline, your hand is up. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think one of the things that just sparked for me when Mukami and Robert were speaking in Aruj as well is also, in addition to the structures like dignity, how can we ensure that there's more resources locally, in country, in region to respond to issues as they come up. And I think that that's particularly important, especially, you know, as we talked about, oftentimes sometimes where the threats are not, you know, could be broader community, could be individuals who are not leaders of organizations, who would have limited access to emergency funding, you know, and things come up both in these moments of crisis, but also kind of in the broader moments that we're seeing, and how as a philanthropic community are we working to ensuring that more resources for emergency safety security are closer to movements, more resources are being managed by movements. You know, in the last 3 years, we've been integrating emergency security funding as part of our core grants for all of the grantees, and connecting organizations with each other in country so that they know this amount of money is available in country to respond to things. And I think there's a lot for us to be thinking about of how do we, and it's also part of how do we break this system of, you know, all the donors are very, how do we break the system of kind of funding that sits outside of the region, sits outside of the country, to ensure that more resources are already readily there?
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Caroline. I think we have a question from Anne Ruth. Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Anne.
Yes, thank you, Aruj, and everybody on the panel. Super interesting views that are being shared. I was wondering about cooperation with religious organizations. As you've also mentioned, there's been a long-term investment in those organizations that promote hate, churches as sites of struggle. 80% of the people globally identify as persons of faith. So it's institutions that we're going to have to engage with more. If we don't in those spaces, we are just giving it away to anti-gender movements and actors who are doing that kind of work. So we are also thinking about a long-term strategy to support LGBTIQ+ inclusive organizations, or at least those that promote understanding and not hate. And that's not easy. And we don't think there's a long list of organizations on the African continent that can safely do that. But my question is, are you aware of any networks besides the Global Interfaith Network that are doing this kind of work? Do you in the panel have any resources on this that are about, firstly, cooperation with religious organizations in a way that does no harm to LGBTIQ+ organizations, and secondly, the narrative work that accompanies this? Thank you.
Thanks. Anne-Roos, could you also introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry, I'm Anne-Roos Wasser. I'm from the Netherlands, Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Human Rights and Multilateral Department.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel who want to? Yeah, perfect. Neville, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, a great question. So there's been a very significant increase in take-up of work with religious organizations by LGBTI groups across Southern Africa in the past 3 years or so. And there are a few groups that are specifically focused on engaging with religious communities. Many of them organizations of LGBTI people who are from faith organizations themselves. So one based in Cape Town that also does region-wide work, which is called Inclusive and Affirming Ministries, IAM. On the other foundation's website, there's a couple of publications that talk about this work. I think the most interesting one from the perspective of the question you've asked is called When Faith Does Violence. And it's an analysis of how religious organizations in Southern Africa have engaged with LGBTI organizations or not, and what has motivated that. I think that in many parts of the region, particularly in Southern Africa, where there's a strong and long history of churches being involved in struggles for liberation, anti-apartheid struggles, there's a foundation to build on. There are strong groups focused on social justice that are faith-based, and I think there's traction there, so we should do this work. But unfortunately, the power of the emboldened religious right at the moment is really pushing back on that. So just by anecdote, in Namibia, the response from the Prime Minister on this new bill is in response to religious groups protesting, and he says that in the statement. Ruth, maybe just to make one broad comment, I think we need to think region-wide as well, and do more work on how we can contain the potential negative impact of Uganda on the rest of the region. So from our perspective as LGBTI activist groups in Southern Africa, the best solidarity that we can be in with our siblings in Uganda and other countries in the region that are facing similar problems is to fireproof progress that has been made in Southern Africa, and to ensure that the court precedents, the social attitudinal change work, the increased voice and visibility is entrenched, and that there's no reversal, that the Uganda narrative does not become the only or dominant African narrative, that there is another narrative about a different reality that is equally African. And we want to intensify elevating that narrative as a counter to what could become easily a mimicking by conservative politicians and religious groups in different countries, including in Southern Africa, and a reversal of the gains that have been made.
Yeah, Neville, I think that absolutely, and I think that was part of what the hope in organizing this space has been, to learn from each other, to support each other, to be in solidarity, and to be able to think about sort of what the what has worked. I mean, I was just on a call for the Dignity Consortium and talking to a staff member from UHAI, where the conference unfortunately had to shift from Kenya to Botswana, and the staff member was like, it was so beautiful to be in a country where decrim is possible, a country on the continent, and how it's so powerful to have that as a possibility as well. So I think that's a really important comment. I saw Anne Ross, was your hand up again? I don't see you, I don't think anymore. There was one question that was left unanswered, which was about data security issues, data privacy and misuse of government or NGO data to target LGBTQI populations. Is there anyone who might want to comment on that, or if there's fears around that, or if you're already seeing that?
Well, I can't comment on that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Neville.
Thanks. I was simply going to say we have seen a little bit of that in Zambia. And so opposition people taking information about groups that have been funded by the Other Foundation and others, and then digging deeper into naming individuals, including in the mass media. But I think we need to apply our minds much more carefully to safety and security from a data perspective now. Sorry, Mokami, I didn't mean to cut you.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah, so the question of data, I think it's something that, as you know, as we were talking earlier about how do we work differently, we really do have to think about that, about data too. I know a lot of funding has come with, whether it is, like Global Fund or PEPFAR or funders where you want to track who the beneficiaries are, you want to have and that information has sometimes been used to track who the people, who queer people are, for example, or put people at risk. So it's to see how is it then, yeah, and this is data that is already with, government workers, bureaucrats out there, and it has been a part of strategies of how movements, and it has had its positive in terms of ability and visibility of folk who exist in this continent and in these countries. But on the other hand, it is now being used as a tool to harm movements. So as we are moving on, as we are seeing how the context is changing, how it still calls to then security keeps changing. How is it that then we engage even at times when we are not at war, quote unquote, because a lot of this is gathered when, we are all working very well with governments, we are all working in partnership, and then a time like this happens, and that is the same data that then it starts to get used to trace folk.
Thanks, Mogami. Are there any other? I see that I don't see any more questions, but any of the panelists, any comments, anything that you forgot to add, or anything that sparked something takeaway before we wrap up?
Yeah, Aruj, I wanted to just speak a little bit about the question related to engagement with religious institutions. So in West Africa, there's the Interfaith Diversity Network of West Africa, INOA, which I know is also a part of the Global Interfaith Network and connected to other structures. And I know that INOA has, in particularly in Ghana, but not exclusively in Ghana, been quite engaged around both work at the intersection, both engagement of people of faith as part of the network, but also support and engagement with faith leaders. In previous years, they've organized speakers bureau training to actually train people to be able to speak from a faith perspective on inclusion and diversity on media and in other public spaces. And I know that they've been engaged also around trying to bring a different perspective in the context of the bill that is in discussion in Ghana. So I think there are structures like that need a lot more support. And I one of the challenges that we see in the region is that there are some allies within faith spaces. I think it's a bit of an untapped potential, but in speaking with a number of partners across countries, particularly looking at indigenous faith, traditional faith leaders, traditional religions, there's a bit more openness. Also, this comes back to the question around how do we engage with people around shaping the narrative, around challenging this idea that LGBTQI is foreign and not African. And I think that particularly traditional faith leaders have a potential to play an important role. And I think in a number of countries, there's some exploratory conversations about what that would look like. But I think the challenge is that even if people are faith leaders, regardless of faith or denomination, are engaged as allies and willing to be and support, the ability to actually stand up and most of them are in the broader Council of Churches or Islamic councils, the ability to actually make change within institution and push things in institutions becomes really challenging. So I think there's a lot more work that also needs to be supported around how, what are some of the strategies for folks to engage within religious spaces where as individuals, there may be people who want to support and be stand up, but are really feel quite restricted by what they can do because of the larger institutions that they're a part of.
Thanks, Caroline. I think that's a really powerful way to close this session in terms of the voices that are, African voices and the importance of Indigenous voices on the continent, to raise those up, to push back against this narrative of LGBTQI issues being a Western import. I want to thank again for everyone on the panel for your time, and for your analysis and the beautiful work that you're doing every day. Sending solidarity from here. And I hope that, folks who've been attending are taking notes and looking at what is possible in terms of the long-term investment. With that, I will hand it back to Stefano and Star with also this message that if anyone's interested in the working group, to message the co-chairs. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Aruj. Just thanking you. I just would like to thank you and the panel for the excellent opportunity and the excellent panel. Thanks the interpreters, and of course, feel free to reach out to myself, Star, Carrie, if you need more information on the Donors Coordination Working Group. So have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.